I am Sarah, and at 35, I felt pretty confident that it was all figured out as an interior designer. I put everything I had into making spaces beautiful. My little apartment was like a cocoon that I could crawl into from the outside world and just exist as me. My early experience of losing my parents was hardly exciting, but it did give me an independence reign. I have become accustomed to the silence of the nights that living solo bring. And just so we are clear, I was not one of those hermits that hid from the world. Work I loved, good friends and coworkers, but long-term love? They weren't on my radar. It was an ordinary evening, one that I had experienced 100 times before. Exhausted after another long day at the office, as soon as I got back home, all my body wanted to do was sink into the white leather couch and mindlessly browse social media. And that was a mindless routine of mine, to de-stress myself. It was then that I saw a message stating, "Hey there, Natalie, your designs are incredible. Did you ever think of doing commercial spaces?" My thumb stopped over the screen. The profile photo was of a nice-looking guy, beaming broadly, Jake Thompson, 38 entrepreneur. I thought for a moment and then answered, "Thanks, Jake. I have completed a couple of commercial projects. However, I do mostly residential spaces. Why do you ask?" This was the one conversation that we had. It was all business at first. He had a small transportation company and was considering renovating his office. But those faded as the days went by. It became about talking life, going to movies or libraries. We loved reading books and chatting in our favorite corners of the city. It was easy, effortless. Just 1 week into our exchanges, and Jake threw me a curveball. "Natalie, I kind of like you. Can I buy you a coffee? Take it easy. Just wanted to meet face to face." I stared at the message, my heart doing a little flip. Sure, why not? There's a great little cafe near my office. How about Saturday at 2? Saturday rolled around, and I found myself standing in front of my closet, suddenly aware of how much of my wardrobe consisted of work clothes. I settled on a casual sundress, something that said, "I made an effort, but I'm not trying too hard." The cafe was buzzing when I arrived. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on Jake. He was even more handsome in person, with kind eyes and an easy smile. He stood up when he saw me, waving me over. "Natalie, it's great to finally meet you," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "Likewise," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." And just like that, we fell into conversation. Jake was attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my work. He told me about his transportation company, the challenges of managing a fleet of trucks and drivers. Time flew by, and before I knew it, we'd been talking for hours. As we left the cafe, Jake turned to me. "I had a great time, Natalie. Would you like to do this again sometime?" I found myself nodding before I even realized it. Yeah, I'd like that. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I started seeing each other regularly. Our coffee dates turned into dinners, and soon we were spending most of our free time together. There was something about Jake that made me feel at ease. He was confident without being arrogant, smart without being condescending. As the months passed, our relationship deepened. Jake introduced me to his mother, Sarah, a kind woman in her 60s who had recently suffered a stroke. She lived with Jake in a modest house on the outskirts of town. "Mom, this is Natalie," Jake said, his arm around my waist. Sarah's face lit up. "Oh, Jake's told me so much about you. Come in, come in." Despite her condition, Sarah was warm and welcoming. We spent the afternoon chatting, and I found myself growing fond of her. It was clear that Jake was devoted to his mother, and seeing this softer side of him made me fall for him even more. As we were leaving, Sarah pulled me aside. "You're good for him, Natalie. I haven't seen Jake this happy in years." Her words stayed with me, warming my heart. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges. Jake's work often kept him busy, and there were times when I felt like I was competing with his company for attention. But he always made time for me, surprising me with lunch dates or leaving sweet notes in my apartment. A year flew by in a whirlwind of love and laughter. On our anniversary, Jake took me to the same cafe where we had our first date. As we finished our meal, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Natalie," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "this past year has been the best of my life. You brought so much joy and love into my world. I can't imagine my life without you." My breath caught in my throat as he got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, unable to speak. Jake slipped the ring onto my finger, and the cafe erupted in applause. As we left, hand in hand, I couldn't stop staring at the ring. It was beautiful, but more than that, it represented a future I never thought I'd have. We decided to have a small wedding, just close friends and family. Sarah was overjoyed, insisting on helping with the planning despite her health issues. The day of the wedding was perfect. As I walked down the aisle, seeing Jake's face light up, I knew I had made the right decision. We exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life threw our way. At the reception, Sarah pulled me aside, her eyes glistening with tears. "Welcome to the family, dear," she said, hugging me tightly. After the wedding, Jake and I decided to move into Sarah's house. It made sense. She needed care, and the house was spacious enough for all of us. I rented out my apartment, packing up my life into cardboard boxes with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The first few months of marriage were blissful. Jake was attentive and loving, always ready with a kiss or a kind word. Sarah and I grew closer, bonding over our shared love of gardening and cooking. It felt like I had gained not just a husband, but a mother as well. Determined to help Sarah recover from her stroke, I hired a massage therapist and a therapeutic gymnastics coach. The improvements were slow but steady. Within a few months, Sarah was walking normally, even starting to putter around in the garden and cook meals. As for Jake and me, we were in no rush to have children. We both wanted to focus on our careers and enjoy our time together. But as our first wedding anniversary approached, I noticed a subtle shift in Jake's behavior. He started staying late at work more often, citing issues with drivers or last-minute client requests. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, running a business wasn't easy, and I often worked late hours myself. One Saturday morning, as I was enjoying my coffee and a good book, Jake announced he had to go into the office. "On a weekend?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, some paperwork I need to catch up on. Don't wait up for me, okay?" As he left, I felt a twinge of unease, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on my plans for the day. It was Sarah who first voiced her concerns. We were in the kitchen preparing dinner when she broached the subject. "Natalie, dear," she began, her voice hesitant, "have you noticed Jake's been working a lot lately? You should keep an eye on him, you know. Don't let him take you for granted." I turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She sighed, looking suddenly older. "Men sometimes, they get restless. They forget what they have at home." Her words sent a chill through me. Was she speaking from experience? I wanted to ask, but something in her expression held me back. That night, as I lay in bed waiting for Jake to come home, Sarah's words echoed in my mind. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that something might be wrong. When Jake finally crawled into bed in the early hours of the morning, I pretended to be asleep. He smelled of cigarette smoke. And was that perfume? My stomach churned, but I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty, this growing doubt. I needed to know the truth, whatever it might be. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and searched for private investigators in our area. It felt wrong, a betrayal of trust. But the alternative, living with this gnawing suspicion, seemed worse. I found a highly rated agency and made an appointment for later that week. As I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Soon, I told myself, I would have answers. Whether I would like those answers was another matter entirely. The detective's office was small and cluttered, with files stacked haphazardly on every surface. The detective himself, a grizzled man in his 50s, introduced himself as Mike. I laid out everything, the late nights, the weekend work, the subtle changes in Jake's behavior. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. It felt good to voice my fears, to have someone listen without judgment. "All right," Mike said when I finished. "Here's what we'll do. We'll track his movements for a few weeks, see if we can establish a pattern. If he's up to something, we'll find out." 3 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Mike. "Mrs. Thompson, I think you should come to my office. I have some information for you." The drive to his office was a blur. My hands shook as I parked, and I had to take a moment to compose myself before going in. Mike was waiting for me, a thick file on his desk. His expression was grim. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson," he began, and my heart sank. "But your suspicions were correct. Your husband has been unfaithful." He pushed the file towards me. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were photos, text messages, hotel receipts, evidence of not one affair, but several. Jake had been seeing multiple women, juggling them with what appeared to be a carefully planned schedule. "He's been meeting them at various hotels," Mike explained gently, "always on different days of the week. It seems he's been doing this for quite some time." I stared at the photos, unable to process what I was seeing. There was Jake, my Jake, with his arm around a blonde woman I'd never seen before. Another showed him kissing a redhead outside a restaurant. My stomach churned. I left Mike's office in a daze, the file clutched to my chest. As I drove home, tears blurred my vision. How could Jake do this to me, to us? What about our vows, our promises? When I pulled into our driveway, I saw that Jake's car wasn't there. Of course not. It was Thursday. According to Mike's report, that was his night with the blonde. Sarah was in the living room when I came in. One look at my face, and she knew. "Oh, Natalie," she said softly. "What happened?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. I collapsed onto the couch next to her and told her everything. My suspicions, hiring the detective, what I'd learned. Sarah gently took the file from my hands and set it aside. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and determination, met mine. "You need to rest, dear. You can't make any decisions in this state. A clear mind is what you need now." I nodded numbly, allowing her to guide me to my feet and towards the stairs. As I climbed each step, I felt as though I was moving through molasses, my body heavy with the burden of my newfound knowledge. "We'll talk more tomorrow," Sarah promised as she saw me to my room. "Try to get some sleep." Sleep, however, proved elusive. I tossed and turned all night, my mind replaying every moment of my marriage, searching for clues I might have missed. When dawn finally broke, I gave up on rest and got ready for work. Work was a blur. I moved through the day on autopilot, my colleagues' concerned glances bouncing off the protective shell I built around myself. As the office emptied out for the evening, I remained at my desk, unable to face the thought of going home. It was dark by the time I finally left, the streets quiet as I made my way back to the house. As I turned onto our street, a strange sight greeted me. The garage door was wide open, and I could hear the rumble of an engine. Suddenly, Sarah came tearing out of the garage in Jake's pickup truck, the tires screeching as she swerved onto the street. My heart leapt into my throat as she barreled towards me, but at the last moment, she slammed on the brakes. "Natalie," she shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. "Get in the car now." Bewildered and alarmed by the wild look in her eyes, I didn't question her. I scrambled into the passenger seat. No sooner had I closed the door than Sarah floored the accelerator, the truck lurching forward with a roar. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jake burst out of the house, his face contorted with rage. He ran after us, shouting and cursing, but Sarah didn't slow down. We tore down the street, leaving him behind. I turned to Sarah, my heart pounding. "What's going on?" I demanded, but the words died in my throat when I saw her expression. She looked terrified, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. We drove in tense silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes. I didn't dare speak, afraid of breaking Sarah's concentration as she navigated the darkening roads. Finally, Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner. She scanned the area carefully before killing the engine, her body still tense. "Come on," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk." Inside the diner, we slid into a booth in the far corner. Sarah ordered coffee for both of us, her eyes constantly darting to the door. When the waitress left, Sarah leaned across the table, speaking in a hushed, frantic whisper. "Natalie, listen to me carefully. We're in danger. An hour ago, I overheard Jake on the phone. He was talking about getting rid of us, Natalie, both of us." I stared at her in shock, my mind reeling from her words. The idea that Jake could be planning to get rid of us seemed too outlandish to be true. Sarah must have sensed my disbelief, because her expression shifted from fear to determination. "You don't believe me," she said, not as a question but a statement. Without waiting for my response, she reached into her purse and pulled out Jake's phone. "I found this in his car when I was leaving. Look for yourself." Together, Sarah and I huddled over the small screen, scrolling through Jake's messages. My heart sank as we came across a conversation with someone labeled NH Director. As we read, the truth of Sarah's words became clearer. Jake wasn't planning to kill us, but his intentions were far from innocent. He was in talks with the director of a state nursing home, discussing ways to have Sarah declared incapacitated and admitted against her will. "Oh my God," I whispered, quickly searching for reviews of the nursing home. What I found made my blood run cold. Neglect, abuse, unsanitary conditions. The stories were nightmarish. I looked up at Sarah, who seemed relieved, but as I read her some of the worst accounts, Sarah's relief turned to anger. "That's not living," she spat. "It's a slow death. It might as well be murder." But Jake's betrayal didn't end there. As we continued to scroll, we found messages to multiple women, his mistresses. The sheer number was staggering, but what hurt the most were his words about me. "Once Mom's out of the way, I'll leave Natalie," one message read. "I'm tired of playing house. I want my freedom." I felt sick, but forced myself to keep reading, copying the messages to my email as evidence. Sarah and I sat in disgusted silence, the weight of Jake's betrayal hanging heavy between us. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have seen this coming," she said. "Jake's father, he cheated on me too. For years, he even had another family. 2 kids I didn't know about until it was too late." My jaw dropped. "Sarah, I had no idea." She nodded sadly. "I turned a blind eye to it all. I loved him and was afraid he'd leave us if I confronted him. I hoped Jake would be different, that seeing his father's mistakes would make him a better man." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But he's been this way since he was young. Always charming, always with a new girl on his arm. I lost count of how many hearts he broke. When he married you, Natalie, I thought he'd finally grown up. I was so happy." I took a deep breath. "I'm going to divorce him. I can't stay with someone who would do this to us." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then, to my surprise, she began to cry softly. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me. I can't face this alone." Without hesitation, I moved to her side of the booth, wrapping my arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. We're family, and we'll get through this together. I promise." As Sarah and I sat in the diner booth, emotionally drained from our discoveries, I felt a weight pressing on my chest. There was one more piece of news I needed to share, something that complicated our situation even further. "Sarah," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, "there's something else you should know." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'm pregnant. I found out just this morning at work. I don't know what to do." Sarah's expression hardened, a fierce determination replacing her initial shock. "I'll tell you what we're going to do," she said, her voice strong and resolute. "We're going to fight back. Jake doesn't get to destroy our lives and walk away unscathed. It's time we took control." We paid for our coffee and headed back to the truck. The drive home was tense but filled with a sense of purpose. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Jake's car parked haphazardly, a clear sign of his agitated state. Taking a deep breath, Sarah and I entered the house. Jake was pacing in the living room, his face contorted with rage. As soon as he saw us, he exploded. "Mom, what the hell were you thinking? Taking off with my truck and my phone. Have you lost your mind?" Before Sarah could respond, I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. I held up the file from the private investigator. "Jake, we need to talk." His eyes darted from me to the file, realization dawning on his face. For a moment he looked panicked, but then his expression smoothed into one of cool indifference. "So you know," he said, his voice eerily calm. "What are you going to do about it, Natalie? Divorce me?" "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I want a divorce." To my shock, Jake laughed. "Come on, Natalie, you're overreacting." "So I had a few flings. It doesn't mean anything. You're not enough for me, but we can make this work. You can stay, be a good wife, and I'll be discreet with my extracurricular activities." I felt a surge of anger and disgust. "You must be joking. I don't need a rat like you in my life, Jake. We're done." Jake's face darkened. He pointed to the door, his voice low and menacing. "Fine. Get out. This is my house, and I want you gone." Before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "Actually, Jake, this is my house. I own it, and I decide who stays and who goes." She took a deep breath. "And I'm telling you to leave now." Jake's jaw dropped, disbelief written all over his face. "Mom, what are you saying? I'm your son. And Natalie, she's nothing to you." Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "You're wrong, Jake. Sarah is like a daughter to me. She's family." Then, with a pointed look at me, she added, "And she's carrying my grandchild." Jake's eyes widened, darting to my stomach. For a moment, hope flickered across his face. You're pregnant? Then I can't leave. The baby needs a father. I shook my head, my resolve stronger than ever. This child doesn't need a father like you, Jake. We'll be fine without you. Sarah nodded in agreement. You heard her, Jake. It's time for you to go. We'll have the locks changed in the morning. Jake looked from Sarah to me, realization dawning that he had lost this battle. Without another word, he stormed upstairs, presumably to pack his things. As the sound of his angry footsteps faded, I turned to Sarah, overwhelmed by the events of the day. She pulled me into a tight hug, and I felt the tension begin to leave my body. The months following that fateful night were a whirlwind of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and new beginnings. The divorce proceedings were messy, as expected, but with the mountain of evidence we had gathered, Jake didn't stand a chance. I sat in the courtroom, my hand resting protectively over my growing belly as the judge delivered her verdict. Jake's numerous infidelities, coupled with his attempts to manipulate Sarah's living situation, worked heavily in my favor. The judge's stern voice echoed through the room as she awarded me a substantial compensation package. Mr. Thompson, she said, her eyes boring into Jake, your actions have been reprehensible. This court finds in favor of Mrs. Thompson and orders you to pay compensation for emotional distress. I watched Jake's face contort with anger and disbelief. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the man I thought I had married, but as I caught Sarah's supportive gaze from the gallery, I knew we had made the right decision. After the court proceedings, Sarah and I sat in her kitchen, our kitchen now, sipping tea and processing the day's events. I've made some changes to my will, Sarah said suddenly, sliding a document across the table to me. I skimmed the paper, my eyes widening as I realized what I was reading. Sarah, you can't. This is too much. She reached out, clasping my hand in hers. Natalie, you and that baby are my family now. Jake, he made his choices. I've disinherited him. The house, my savings, they're yours and my grandson's now. As my due date approached, Sarah and I spent our evenings preparing the nursery. One night, as we folded tiny onesies and arranged stuffed animals, Sarah turned to me with a serious expression. Natalie, she said, her voice soft but determined, I want you to know that we're going to raise this boy right. He's going to grow up to be a man who respects women, who understands the value of loyalty and honesty. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. You're right. He won't have his father around, but maybe that's for the best. He won't have to see that negative example. Sarah's eyes misted over. I made mistakes with Jake. I let him see his father's behavior and didn't do enough to counteract it. But this time it'll be different. This little boy will grow up surrounded by strong women who won't tolerate disrespect or infidelity.